And finally we have Breath of the Wild, and this might be a little bit controversial, but Breath of the Wild for me is going right here. Hey music friends, this is Davi Vasc, I'm a music composer for games, and a lot of you don't know this, but The Legend of Zelda is actually my favorite game series of all time, and with the 35 years of the series and all, I thought it would be fun for us to remember the music from these Zelda games that we love by making a ranking of all the Zelda soundtracks. This will be a bit of a challenge for me, by the way. Let's see how well I can remember all these soundtracks. Let's go! First off, we have the Legend of Zelda for the NES, right? It's the first Legend of Zelda, and if we're talking the first Legend of Zelda for the NES, we have to start by listening to this, right? This is an impressive track. This is an impressive composition. I think this theme alone should grant The Legend of Zelda a high ranking. Just the cultural impact of this theme alone and the historical relevance. Other than that, this soundtrack is not super impressive musically. I mean, it's the NES, it's very limited, it's limited audio channels, limited audio quality. Oh yeah, the dungeon theme is also pretty cool. Yeah, so overall, musically it's not super impressive, but I think you gotta respect it. I'm gonna go ahead and give it an S tier just for the historical weight and the ability to stand the test of time of this soundtrack, especially the main theme. Moving on, now we have Zelda 2, and Zelda 2 is not gonna be up here. I think it will do well in D tier. It's not impressive. It has all the downsides of Zelda 1, you know, the limited audio quality of the NES, but without any of the upsides. Like, for example, the town theme. This is something that I feel with a lot of Zelda 2 soundtrack. It's not bad, but it feels like, much like with the game itself, the soundtrack, Koji Kondo was still experimenting a lot and trying to find that Zelda sound. So this is not bad, but it doesn't sound much like Zelda to me. I think the track that managed to stand the test of time the most in Zelda 2 is that dungeon track that gets used in Smash Bros all the time. Yeah, it's this one. See, this is a great track, but it doesn't have that Zelda soul to me. So now, chronologically, we have A Link to the Past, and A Link to the Past is the easiest S tier in this entire list, right? If I said that on Zelda 2, Koji Kondo was trying to find that Zelda sound, that Zelda soul, in A Link to the Past, he 100% found it. There's so many good tracks in this, and so many tracks that stood the test of time and still get used to this day in Zelda games. Let's see here. Of course, Hyrule Castle is amazing. What's cool about this is that at this point, the audio quality of these games had progressed to a point where you could have actual orchestral sounds in these songs. So good. Wait, there's a track named Great Victory that sounds like something Borat would say. Great Victory! The Dark World theme is also one of my favorites. Amazing melody. So adventurous. Next we have Ocarina of Time, and that's gonna be an S tier as well. I know I'm giving away a lot of S tiers, but trust me, it won't stay like that for long. Ocarina of Time, much like A Link to the Past, has really helped define the Zelda sound. There are still a ton of Ocarina of Time tracks that get used and reused to this day in modern Zelda games. And in some ways, it's even a bit of an improvement on A Link to the Past. Listen to this. This sounds like no other Zelda music before. It's so melancholic, so deep and moody. This is Koji Kondo starting to explore a new side of Zelda that will appear more often from here on out. It's the dramatic and melancholic and deeper and more emotional side of Zelda. And that, I think, is a big deal. It's a big improvement. The cartoony stuff is fine. We all love that. But this kind of stuff will lead on to the more emotional stuff in the series later down the line, like Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess. One other cool thing about the Ocarina of Time soundtrack is that the Ocarina mechanics in-game that the players had to play using the controller originated this unique style of Zelda music, of songs based on 3 notes. And with that we got some incredible tracks like Lost Woods, Zelda's Lullaby is a big one. Now we have Link's Awakening, and Link's Awakening, it's a C tier. There's nothing too outstanding about it. It did what it could with the Game Boy. I really like the Ballad of the Windfish. Such a nice melody. I remember listening to this track when I was a kid and thinking there's something else about this track. The soundtrack of this game is fine, but there's something else about this. And that's the first Zelda soundtrack that was not composed by Koji Kondo, by the way, so that's cool. This starts a long line of excellent Zelda composers that will come later on. Next up we have the Oracle games for the Game Boy Color, and from what I remember they were a bit of a step up from Link's Awakening music-wise, so I'm gonna go ahead and give them a B tier. I remember loving the Zelda Awakening theme. Where is it? So pretty, very nostalgic. I love this part. I feel like in the Oracle games they were taking the soundtrack a bit more seriously. You know, in Link's Awakening there's a few tracks that feel to me like they were like, this is just a Game Boy game, whatever. So we ended up getting in Link's Awakening songs like this, for example. Which is a good track, don't get me wrong, but it's a 10-second loop, come on. There is also in the Oracle games a theme called Sad Theme. Well, sounds pretty sad. Now we have Majora's Mask, and Majora's Mask is for sure another S tier. Just the boldness of this game, the audacity of this game to be so depressing, so dark, and the way it plays around with the cartoony songs, it definitely has the kind of songs that you would expect in a Zelda game, like the Clock Town theme, for example. This is Zelda music, right? It's very cheerful and upbeat. It's an amazing composition. But then he goes and keeps twisting it around and making it more disturbing and more depressing. Sounds disturbing, right? Especially if you've played the game and you know the context of this. I've never seen a game pull off urgency and darkness and melancholy the same way that Majora's Mask has. You know, other games try, they have edgy themes and dark music and violence and whatnot, but Majora's Mask is something else. The Song of Healing is one of my favorites too. Next up we have The Wind Waker, and The Wind Waker is a solid A tier. I love this soundtrack, it's a fantastic soundtrack, and this is my favorite game of all time, by the way. I wish I could put it here on the S tier, but I don't think the soundtrack alone justifies it. I do love how they put a Celtic European folk flair into the music of this game. It's very unique to this game. Timeless. This is my happy place right here. So good. Dragon Roost Island, another classic. One pet peeve that I have with this soundtrack, which is something that will start to show its head a little bit more often from here on out on Zelda soundtracks, is the overusage, the over-reliance on old themes. You know, using old themes is fine, especially in a long-running series like this. Composers love doing this. I do this in my own soundtracks. But then you start to see stuff like this. The Outset Island theme, great theme. It's loosely based on Kokiri's Forest theme from Ocarina of Time. Okay, cool, I get it. Outset Islands is the first area of the game, so I understand the reference there. But then you go to Forest Haven Island, and Forest Haven Island is also based on Kokiri Forest theme from Ocarina of Time, because I guess it's the forest area. So I guess we should reference Kokiri Forest every time you get a sword, for example, because in Ocarina of Time you get your first sword in Kokiri Forest. You see, is that necessary to do it this many times? But whatever, A tier is still extremely good, and Wind Waker is an extremely good soundtrack. Moving on, now we have Four Swords, and Four Swords I think suffers a little bit from the same things that Zelda 2 suffers. I think it fits very well in the D tier. It's not bad, the music's not bad, there's some cool music in it, but it doesn't have that Zelda soul that we all know and love. There's the mandatory Zelda's Lullaby. See, that's the kind of original music they have in this soundtrack. It's not bad. This sounds straight up like Mario music. Next up is the Minish Cap, and oh man, the Minish Cap is such a good soundtrack. It's definitely an A tier. There's so many good tracks in this, and the GBA sound is so charming. I love how new it sounds. It doesn't rely too much on old tracks. So much fun. I remember a very nice track from a wood kind of level. Minish Woods. Yes. Next in line is Four Swords Adventures, which is a step down from Four Swords on the GBA. I'm gonna give it an F tier, honestly. There's barely any original music in it. 90% of the soundtrack is based on either A Link to the Past or Ocarina of Time. So remember when I was talking about Wind Waker, when I was complaining about the reusage of songs, this problem here is multiplied 1,000-fold. Okay, yeah, so this is just the A Link to the Past main theme, but that's understandable because it's the main theme, you know. But then again, A Link to the Past. See what I mean? This is just the boss battle theme from A Link to the Past. And I'm not saying this sounds bad, it sounds very good, but of course it wouldn't sound bad because it's A Link to the Past. But come on, make some new music. What breaks my heart about this is that I just think about the composer in a time like this. Because the composers always want to create new stuff. The composer wants to leave his mark on the game, on the industry. So I just imagine the composer getting the call, letting him know that he got the gig, he's gonna be the composer for the next Zelda game. This is a big break. And then on his first day of work, like Shigeru Miyamoto or whatever comes up to him and say, okay, so the soundtrack is going to be 90% based on A Link to the Past, okay? And the composer's like, okay. The next one is Twilight Princess, and Twilight Princess is a great one. It's a very deep, very emotional soundtrack. In a lot of ways, I feel like it was trying to be Majora's Mask to a certain extent, but less successful. It has those dark, melancholic themes. It's not an S tier though. I don't think it's an S tier because let's not forget that a live orchestral score at this point was long overdue for the Zelda series. Twilight Princess should have had a live orchestral score, but at the same time I feel like it should be higher than this two. Hold up. Okay, that makes more sense to me because it feels unfair to put it on the same level as these two. I feel like it has an extra layer of meaningfulness, of emotion, of heart. Midna is a very fleshed out character in this game, at least more fleshed out than we usually get in Zelda games, and the music definitely reflects that. The title screen is also very emotional, so much feeling. Oh, and also Twilight Princess has the best shop theme in any game ever. Okay, so Phantom Hourglass on the Nintendo DS. I think C tier is fine. There's nothing too memorable about it. I remember it being very reliant on Wind Waker themes. Oh yeah, Lineback's theme is very good. Next we have Spirit Tracks, and Spirit Tracks is a big improvement over Phantom Hourglass. I think it's a solid A tier. There's so many good tracks in this. I feel like it's very equivalent in a way to Minish Cap. It has a sound very much of its own, but at the same time it sounds very much like Zelda, and there are so many good tracks, and much like Minish Cap as well with the charming GBA sound. Here they really captured a very charming side of the sound samples, of the instrument samples of the Nintendo DS era as well. This opening theme is amazing. I love how in this soundtrack they use the pan flute a lot. It gives this soundtrack a very unique feeling, very unique sound. ABODA Village is amazing as well. I remember... so good. I remember trying to play this melody all the time on the flute way back in the day. This one is my favorite from this entire soundtrack. Such a good melody, so adventurous. Next up we have Skyward Sword, and Skyward Sword is also an A tier. It's a very nice soundtrack. I love what they did with this game, with the main theme of this game being Zelda's Lullaby backwards. That's charming, that's imaginative. And this game was also the first game to have a live orchestrated score. It was not fully orchestrated, but there were a lot of tracks in this with a live orchestra, which adds a lot to the music for sure. SKYLOFT, classic. I remember there being a boss theme later on in the game that really blew me away at the time. Let me see if I can find it. It's this one. But my favorite track in this entire soundtrack is this one. Next one is A Link Between Worlds, and that, I'm afraid, is going to be an F tier. It's the same story as Four Swords Adventures. It's an almost remake based on A Link to the Past. So many of the tracks are based off of A Link to the Past. They do sound good, don't get me wrong. I love what they did with the ensemble, the orchestral ensemble in this game. They made it very small, very cozy. See, this sounds very good. They made it so different from the original Dark World theme from A Link to the Past. It sounds so small, so cozy with the guitar. Sounds more folkish. Yeah, considering that, maybe I should give it a D. I'm still mad because did it really have to be based on A Link to the Past? Come on. Make a new game. And also, to be honest, A Link Between Worlds has something that A Link to the Past didn't have, which is individual tracks for each dungeon. In A Link to the Past, they had only one single track for every dungeon. So, yeah, I guess a D tier is good for A Link Between Worlds. The dungeon themes for A Link Between Worlds were pretty cool. Oh, now we have Triforce Heroes, and guys, let me tell you about the soundtrack of Triforce Heroes. This is the most underrated Zelda soundtrack of all time. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm not gonna give it an S, but I think an A+ together with Twilight Princess. Obviously, it's not as deep and emotional and melancholic as Twilight Princess, but for what it is, which is a fun party game, it's so good, it's so new. If they had just recycled a bunch of tracks from A Link Between Worlds, no one would complain, except for me, I guess. But they dared to let the composer be free to create, to go in a new direction. And this is the result. That's the result you get when you let composers compose. This main theme is so happy. Something cool that they did on this soundtrack as well is the inclusion of vocals. This sounds so much fun. And finally we have Breath of the Wild, and this might be a little bit controversial, but Breath of the Wild for me is going right here into the S tier. I get it, we were all a bit shocked when we first heard Breath of the Wild's music because it's so different, but this S tier is for the boldness, for the audacity of making the artistic decision that is best for the game. The purpose of a video game soundtrack is to serve the game, and Zelda Breath of the Wild is not the same type of game that Zelda games before it were. So, does the Breath of the Wild soundtrack suit the kind of Zelda game that Breath of the Wild became? Absolutely it does. So, it is a very good soundtrack, and I think it will set the pace, much like A Link to the Past set the standard for Zelda games after. I think Breath of the Wild will do the same. Man, feels so lonely. And let's not forget that Breath of the Wild also has these classical style Zelda songs in it too. Like this definitely sounds like it could be in Twilight Princess, for example. If you're a Zelda fan, I bet you will enjoy watching this Breath of the Wild cover that I did over here. It's very chill, very relaxing, and I also have another video similar to this one where I rank all the village themes from the Monster Hunter series if you're into that. So make sure to pick one of these, and I'll see you there.